Mr. Joyce, amendment number 1. You're recognized to present your amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk and ask that it be considered as read.
It's considered read and the gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment simply put prohibits penalization of financial institutions solely because the institution provides financial services to an entity that involves a properly registered state-compliant marijuana-related company. To be clear, the business or entity must be operating within the laws of the state to avoid penalization. This is not about whether or not one approves of marijuana. This is about public safety and financial transparency. While 46 states, 3 territories, and a district now allow cannabis-related businesses to operate, our banks and credit unions cannot provide financial services to them. Strangely enough, ATMs are allowed inside dispensaries, so one may withdraw funds from their bank to make a purchase in cash. This situation is untenable. No industry can operate safely and transparently without access to banks or other financial institutions. To ensure these legitimate going concerns are safe, legitimate, and operating completely within the laws of the licensing state, we must allow them access to the financial system. I urge support of my amendment in the interest of financial transparency and public safety and reserve the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Chairman Grace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll just leave it at this. I look forward to watching the committee hash this out for a little while.
Well. Mr. Quigley.
I was tempted to say the opponents of this are dazed and confused, but I'll hold back. I do rise in support of the Joyce Amendment. It is ridiculous that at a time when the majority of states allow some form of recreational or medical use, that these businesses are forced to operate as all cash operations, having no choice but to pay their taxes, employee salaries, and rent with bags of cash. When I think of an all-cash operation, I think of the mob or a cartel, not a legal, regulated business. We are effectively telling these businesses that they should operate like the black market, encouraging obscurity rather than transparency. Additionally, by denying legal businesses access to banking services such as credit card processing and deposit revenues, a public safety risk is created. Recent headlines demonstrate this risk, reporting of robberies, home invasions, and other threats associated with possessing large sums of cash. Regardless how each of us may view the legalization of marijuana, I think we all agree that financial institutions should be allowed to serve businesses that are operating legitimately. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, which respects states' rights and prioritizes public safety.
Further discussion on the Joyce Amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Seeing a number of hands. Mr. Stewart's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I do look forward to this, as the subcommittee chairman said, a robust debate on this, but I'll be very brief. First, I'd like to point out there's some confusion, and it's brought into this debate. There is a meaningful difference between medicinal marijuana and recreational use of marijuana. That's not apples and oranges, that's apples and dinosaurs. These are very, very different issues. And don't conflate the two by saying, well, some of these are used by those who are supporting the medicinal use. I'm talking about the recreational use, which is, by the way, the vast majority of the use of and the revenue generated by this. So ask yourself these very simple questions. Do you think it's a good idea generally to promote the use of recreational use of marijuana in our society? If you think that's a good thing, then support this. Do you think it's good for our society generally to have more and more marijuana use or less? If you think the answer is more is better, then go ahead and support this amendment. Do you think you want to legitimize the use of marijuana to our kids? If you think that's a good idea, then support this amendment. If you think it's a good idea to signal to the business community that having a marijuana dispensary is on par with having a car dealership or selling tires or any other business, then go ahead and support this amendment. I, on the other hand, think we should discourage that type of use. And one of the ways we discourage that is making it harder for these businesses to carry out their business. And if they're using all cash, then I say, you know what? They knew that going into this. Let them deal with it. Let's not help them and make it easier for them. And I yield back.
Further discussion. Ms. Lee is recognized.
Thank you very much. I rise in support of Mr. Joyce's amendment. This is a bipartisan proposal, it would prohibit federal agencies from unduly penalizing financial institutions for providing basic banking services to legitimate cannabis businesses in states where it's legal. This amendment would ensure that legitimate business owners can comply with state regulations and help ensure that regulators and law enforcement officials can hold businesses accountable. And for the 46 states and jurisdictions that have passed cannabis reform laws, this amendment would provide important financial certainty to business owners, employees, government agencies, and financial institutions. Now, regardless of how you feel about the legalization or decriminalization of cannabis, I think we all can agree that the state has made their own decisions to take action and to pass a range of various laws pertaining to medical or adult use cannabis. It's become increasingly apparent that there is a need to align federal and state laws when it comes to addressing the banking crisis, which it is. Last year, the legal cannabis industry was worth around $10 billion, but is largely forced to operate exclusively in cash. These outdated and predatory policies are a major obstacle to these small businesses and only serve to undermine their financial security. In forcing small businesses to operate as all cash businesses, these policies make the jobs of state regulators and tax collectors unnecessarily difficult. And it leaves these entrepreneurs, their employees, and the business itself vulnerable to dangerous criminal targeting. It's a matter of public safety and economic necessity. In fact, in California, our state treasurer has called for action on the cannabis banking industry, saying we all have an obligation to take reasonable and necessary steps to protect our citizens and ensure businesses operating legally within California are engaged fully in our banking and commerce system. Now, I've visited small businesses like these in my home district in Oakland, California, and I know how it impacts I know how it impacts the lack of access to financial services. Using these services will allow entrepreneurs and small businesses to ensure their financial security, grow their business, and better serve their communities. So I urge my colleagues to listen to legal and job-creating businesses in your own districts where these laws have been passed and support this amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Dr. Harris is recognized.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in opposition to this amendment. The last amendment we had dealt with medical marijuana. This is the incrementalism we're seeing. When we restrained the Department of Justice a few weeks ago from enforcing federal law, it was medical marijuana. This amendment is not about medical marijuana. It's about big marijuana businesses. There's a reason why the big dollar's involved in lots of cash, because drug dealing makes a lot of money, and it involves a lot of cash. And no matter what we want, no matter what other name we can call it, marijuana is a controlled substance. It's Schedule 1. It's drug dealing under federal law. And the gentleman from Utah is absolutely right. What we're doing, if we pass this amendment, is we're condoning drug dealing for recreational use. And there may be small businesses involved. Some of them may be. But as soon as you remove the financial obstacles, this is going to be big business. There are going to be big growers involved, big distributors involved. Pharma, move over, because now you've got a whole other industry dealing with drugs. But this is just not my opinion. The other thing, by the way, is, where do we stop with Schedule 1 substances allowing banks to do it? What if, some states, I understand Oregon is considering legalizing heroin. So we're going to allow the banks to participate in that as well. It's a slippery slope we don't want to go to. We really should have the argument about legalization first. But you don't have to take my opinion. I've got 2 letters here, and I'll read briefly from them, and then I'll ask to be entered into the record. From the National Fraternal Order of Police. Represents 355,000 police officers in the United States. Asking this committee, and Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, because you got this letter today, asking this committee to please not pass this legislation. They say, quote, public safety is threatened by the growing use of marijuana nationwide with the greatest negative impact in states that no longer comport with existing federal law. It's exactly what who this amendment addresses. So this is from the National Fraternal Order of Police. But if you don't believe National Fraternal Order of Police, the Major Cities Chief Association. These are the police chiefs of major cities. They say the facts are undeniable. The legalization of marijuana has only hindered local law enforcement's efforts to keep communities safe. These are the people that men and women and families in this country entrust to keep our community safe. Mr. Chairman, they plead with this committee not to pass this amendment. Look, at some point we might get to the point where this is in order. I think it's way premature. I will oppose the amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. So Ms. Pingree from Maine is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to speak in support of this bipartisan amendment. I disagree with my colleagues. I don't think this is not related to how you feel about legalizing marijuana. In my state in 2016, with a referendum, our voters voted to legalize marijuana. We already had medical marijuana. Then last month, our legislature passed and even overrode a governor's veto statutory and regulatory framework. So soon in our state, we're going to have businesses officially operating, selling marijuana as a business, just as you would sell any legal product, because it is legal in our state. But these entrepreneurs are going to end up with one hand tied behind their back, unsure whether they can get access to capital to start or expand their business and use the banking system. I just had a visit from the Maine credit unions, and they told me they are eager to help, but they're worried about the risks of lending if federal regulators interfere based on federal law. The Joyce Amendment would eliminate this risk, provide protection both for lenders and the businesses who need capital to serve their customers. I agree with many of my colleagues who mentioned that this will help law enforcement. Without being able to use the banking system, you have businesses who are storing enormous amounts of cash from marijuana transactions, and this is already happening with medical marijuana. It's unsafe, it's a recipe for abuse. Access to regulated financial services will provide some peace of mind to businesses, customers, and the public. I just want to say further, I think one of the reasons that many of us are making basically exactly the same argument is because it is ludicrous to have a legal business that cannot use the banking system. It promotes crime, it makes it difficult for these businesses, and I wholeheartedly support this amendment for the benefit of my states and other states where this is legalized, and hope my colleagues will do the same. And
Thank the gentlewoman for her remarks. Mr. Rogers, former Chairman Rogers, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Might I ask Mr. Joyce, what is the significance of the states that are mentioned in your amendment?
I'm sorry, sir.
What is the significance of mentioning the states that you have in your amendment?
Because each one of the states.
Could you just repeat his question? Because I'm not sure everybody heard it. The significance of the states.
The fine chairman asked, what's the significance of the states that are listed in the amendment? And that is because only the states that have some form of either medicinal and recreational use are the ones that are listed there. There are other states that have made this choice not to be involved, and so therefore you're not bringing them into the system because they're not part of it. You're only those states in which the state, either legislature or the vote of the people, has enacted the laws to allow the cannabis industry into their state.
Well, for states that do not want to legalize recreational marijuana, the involvement of the financial community, the banks, is one of the last remaining things that a state has to keep from legalizing marijuana in their state, if that's what they want to do. Because the bank, by handling the cash from an illegal act in many states, is an aider and an abettor, and can be and could be charged and convicted of conspiracy to violate the state law or the federal law. And let's bear in mind, the federal law, even today, does not legalize recreational marijuana. States, many states, some states, have done the same. If they're not able to use the financial institution feature that we're talking about, the states lose one of the last possible ways to keep from being legalized over their objection. And I don't think we should be telling a state what they should do about this matter. I'll close with this. All of the polls and all of the information and research that we've seen says that marijuana is the stepping stone, particularly for young people, toward opioid abuse, which boils my blood. I yield.
The gentleman from Kentucky, Ms. McCollum, is recognized. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, thank you. I support the Joyce Amendment, which prevents funds from being used to penalize financial institutions that provide banking services to state legal marijuana businesses. Now, you have the 46 states that have reformed their marijuana laws to allow for some form of medical or adult use. My home state of Minnesota, for the gentleman from Utah, recently legalized some forms of medical marijuana for use under certain circumstances, under a doctor's use. And I'm going to read from the Minnesota Department of Health. For patients to receive medical cannabis, the law requires a licensed healthcare provider to certify that the patient has one or more of the qualifying conditions. A qualifying physician, as your healthcare practitioner, must certify that you have one of the qualifying physicians and conditions, and it's all spelled out here. The most compelling people to testify in Minnesota, we have very strict controls on how the medical marijuana is used, were parents of children with epilepsy, and what a game changer it was for these children. And their parents were going to give up their jobs and sell their houses and go to states where they could have access to this transformational change for these young adults. And there's other medical conditions in Minnesota in which it is prescribed and used too. So denying a state-sanctioned business that's operating entirely within the laws of their state and to keep them from banking is just irresponsible, and it's a threat to public safety. Why would we want a doctor who is legally prescribing under certain circumstances, which is heavily regulated in Minnesota, to be forced into a cash-only environment? We should be encouraging law-abiding citizens running small businesses to work within our banking systems, not putting them at risk, not putting communities, not putting families that they serve in danger. This amendment for Minnesota and for many of us is not about legalizing marijuana. It is about safe banking. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for her remarks. Sheriff Rutherford is recognized, and Mr. Amadei and any others, please do indicate. Yes, Mr. Ryan. Sheriff, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I rise to speak in opposition to this bill, even though I think it's well known that I support investigating and research for determining the efficacy of marijuana for medical purposes. In fact, I was very involved in the state legislature in Florida a few years back when we actually had Charlotte's Web, which is a marijuana extract that was actually passed by a very conservative, quite frankly, Republican House and Senate in the state legislature. So I'm very much in favor of looking at marijuana from its medical use. However, I also understand that from my time as sheriff that national, transnational organizations, these cartels face two problems. Number one is bringing drugs into the country across our border. And the second is moving large amounts of cash back across the border. And that is an opportunity as well to intervene in the drug trade affecting our country. And so one of the things that those in the Justice Department have begun to see is a lot more attempts by drug cartels to actually move their money through wire transfers and banking operations, which is why DEA and others have begun to really focus on that as an element. And I'm really concerned about marrying together through these banking processes, illicit and legal marijuana funds. So for that reason, Mr. Chairman, I oppose the bill.
Thank the gentleman for his remarks. Mr. Ryan is recognized.
Credit unions looking to Congress for reassurance that it is safe to do business with legal marijuana.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Mr. Amade is
Thanks, Mr.
recognized,
Chairman.
And then I see Mr. Adderholt. And Mr.
Briefly, and I want to thank my colleague from Ohio who's taken the first step in this. But coming from a state which regulates a few vices, the record should reflect that nobody laughed when that last statement was. There's some things that we should talk about here. It's like, okay, you want them to bank? Great. That's fine with me. I get the public safety stuff. I get all that stuff. But guess what? There's that regulatory piece and that law enforcement piece, which if you're a regulated vice, guess what? Those regulators and those law enforcement people get to come in and see your accounts anytime they want. They don't need to play hopscotch. They don't need a warrant. They want to make sure that you're doing business as that legally state licensed deal and that you haven't got the folks from other countries in the hemisphere doing things. That's missing. That's very important. And let me just tell you one other thing, and I know it's not within this committee's jurisdiction, but if you're going to let these folks access that banking system, which is regulated state and federally, I can assure you that whether it's the Buckeye state or the whodunit state on the list, they're getting tax revenue from it. And so to just give it away for no tax revenue, if we've learned anything in terms of alcohol and other vices, tobacco's an instance, then guess what? Alcohol's taxed federally and tobacco's taxed federally. Why would this be exempt? And this bill, this amendment, which I want to support, but I ain't giving it away for nothing. So with all due respect, if we really want to do it, and I want to do it, we ought to get some tax revenue out of it and learn those lessons of tobacco and alcohol. And oh, by the way, we ought to be able to check on the records anytime we want. So all this sanctity and virginity in the state stuff is confirmed by the feds. Thank you. Good evening, and God bless vices.
Oh, boy. Mr. Adderholt, I believe, wishes to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In the wake of Mr. Amade's remarks.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just wanted to say, certainly, we don't oppose the person bringing the amendment, but there are some concerns that I think many of us have about the amendment itself. I just received a note from the sheriffs from Alabama, and they had indicated to me they're very much concerned about the amendment. And so I would say that the timing on this is definitely not right, and that we need to hold off on this amendment and all due respect to its sponsor. Thank you.
Anything? Yes, Ms. Capter is recognized.
Yes, I just wanted to say, put a couple facts out there. Former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, according to press reports, who was from the state of Ohio, as some people might remember, has changed his position and now serves on the board of a company called Acreage Holdings, a company that cultivates, processes and dispenses cannabis. Okay, so it's just interesting some of the things that happen around here. I don't know what that means. That's what I read in the newspaper. I haven't had a chance to ask him about that. The other thing I just want to mention, and I know Congressman Joyce is very careful in his wording, but you know, in my district, they're cutting marijuana with the black tar heroin and fentanyl now. People are dying of it. And I don't know how you separate this. I don't know how I voted for medical marijuana, thinking it would be tightly regulated. And I'm not sure what we have right now in our country. All I know is in Ohio, we have such an epidemic. I just left another sheriff in one of our counties, and he needed money for more officers. And all of the deputy chiefs, everybody that's worked in, I'll tell you the county, Lorain County, Ohio, they were asking me for help from the federal government to hire more officers just to deal with what is occurring in that one location, and that's only one of 88 counties in deep trouble because of addiction and deaths related to these substances. So I'm uncomfortable. I want to support my colleague from Ohio, and he's probably very well intentioned. I just think that some of this has implications beyond what maybe some of us even completely understand. And with some states having some laws and other states not having those laws, pretty soon we're going to get an amendment up here to have state reciprocity, just like we do with guns. If you can, conceal and carry in Indiana, then can you walk it into Ohio or vice versa? Well, what's the difference with this? We have an epidemic in this country, and I want to trace the money. I want to do that, but I'm very, and you want it to be in the sunshine, right? You want to do what's right. I just am not sure this amendment at this time, maybe, and it doesn't say medical marijuana in the amendment, and for me, that is a troubling factor. So I just wanted to put that on the record, and I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Captain. Mr. Jenkins would like to be recognized. You are recognized.
Would the sponsor of the amendment yield?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm really struggling with this because I'm a states' rights guy, but I'm also concerned about the slippery slope. And I know West Virginia is listed on this, and West Virginia has legalized medical marijuana non-combustible, so very narrow sliver. But already since that's passed, there's been legislative efforts at the state level to expand that. And I think every state, wherever you are on the spectrum, your state's probably going to be pushing for expansion at some point in time. Number one, I assume once your state is named here and it says whatever the state laws, as the state law expands, so too would obviously the financial institution's ability to service that. So you're not locked into whatever the state of the law is in your state at the point of passage of this. So if you went from medical marijuana to full recreational, this would still give carte blanche ability for financial institutions without concern of penalty service the recreational, even though you may be medical today only.
Correct.
Okay. Secondly, are there other regulatory aspects? We know, just as Dr. Harris referenced a week or two ago, DOJ in the limited area of medical marijuana. While this is not limited to medical marijuana, this is dealing with financial institutions. Are there other regulatory entities at the federal level that the marijuana industry is concerned about, and we're taking care of financial institutions today? Are there other folks on down the pike that are going to be given waivers potentially if we should so choose?
I can't answer that with specificity because I have not looked through every single regulatory agency to figure out.
Law enforcement, we're taking care of financial institutions if this passes. Are there others in the queue potentially?
One thing that was brought up at the last hearing we had in which we talked about the law enforcement aspects in the CJS hearing, and I fully agree with my friend from Maryland, Dr. Harris, there needs to be research. We need to know in states where you have where now it is legal, what is the amount that someone can operate machinery under? At what point they come to work? They're going to have other going concerns that have people employed by them. At what point do they have to worry that this person shouldn't be operating machinery? this person shouldn't be behind the desk, shouldn't be operating a computer. We need to have the research. As we talked about before, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, because right now we're denying state universities and others the ability to do the research until we pass something. And obviously, as an institution, we don't have the guts to get this done. And it's been this absolutely changed my mind, similar to my dear friend John Boehner, who has said his thinking has evolved, as well as others here, that it was Sam Farr, a member of this committee, that was telling me that in California, he had a fine VA hospital. The VA hospital was not allowed to give medicine that would treat PTSD for our soldiers, and if found to be effective, was not allowed to do it in his hospital. And the more you think about it, and the more I've watched this, we continue to grow the industry, but we continue to not act like it doesn't exist. Well, you know, we talk about illegal drug dealers. This takes them off the street. This takes it, yes, it does legitimize it, but we had a thing called prohibition. How'd that work? And then we have a thing, and I agree completely with Mr. Amadei, with the fact that we should have these financial institutions. Everything should be above board. Everything should be transparent. Every member of the 46 states that has voted for this should know exactly how much is being sold and track it like they do right now from seed to sale and be able to know exactly what this is. And so deal with it accordingly. If we consider that we continue to put our
Mr.
head-
Jenkins, this is your time. You're yielding. Continue to yield.
I yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Herrera Butler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the sponsor of this amendment is touching on just how difficult, I shouldn't say that, just how complex this issue is. There are so many far-reaching facets. I'm from a state that has legalized recreational marijuana.
Thank you.
And I wish we hadn't. I did a call with my school superintendents, my police chiefs, and my sheriffs. I wanted to talk about the state of our schools and our kids and what they thought would help. I fully expected them to start the whole conversation off talking about guns. And they spent the first 10 or 15 minutes talking about the harm that the use of recreational marijuana has done in our schools with our kids. I was flabbergasted. And now I recognize this is with regard to medical or medicinal marijuana. And that's a subject, I can't remember who said it, it's one I support. I have talked to parents who have very young children who've suffered major seizure disorders, who have found types or a use for medical marijuana, and obviously not smoking it, but there's a way to extract, and they've seen a benefit. And boy, if I was that mom, I'd do everything possible, right? So I get that and I support that, but my concern with this amendment is we're doing it here and now at this hour with this short amount of time without the input of all of our colleagues, when this is an issue that is so much bigger than a one-year appropriations bill. There are so many valid points on this, and the reason I am not going to be able to support it is because I'm too. Until you sat next to a drug addict at a round table who's looked at you and said the biggest mistake you folks ever made was legalizing recreational marijuana, and I'm sitting there going, first of all, I didn't do it. But when his heart is breaking, he's telling you that, it just causes me to want to pause this effort here. There are good people on all sides of this. I've talked with my credit unions too, but I don't think that this is the place to do it. And I'm not saying that as a punt. I'm saying I want to get this right. So with that, I unfortunately oppose the gentleman's amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Judge Carter of Texas is recognized for time.
I apologize for my voice today, but I want to say, if there's $900,000 in cash in a marijuana shop garage someplace because they can't get in the banking system, then there's $900 million worth of marijuana cash somewhere in the cartel system. The cartels run the marijuana in Mexico in a gigantic way. And Mr. Harris is right. The second problem they have is what to do with cash. They got the same problem that marijuana shop guy's got. Now, if we make it legal for people to do it in the United States, then they're either going to offer some major incentives to get illegal marijuana trade into our banking system, or they're going to do what they do down on the border. They're going to cut somebody's hand or leg off to convince them to put marijuana in their system. And dollars don't look any different. $900,000 doesn't look any different whether it's legal or illegal. I think this is something we need to think out. There's a reason we have laws to restrict cash deposits is so we can find illicit drug trade. That's why we have that law. If we are waiving it, we're running into a problem, and law enforcement will not like it. Yield back.
Chairman's asked for time. I yield some of my time to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me just commend the committee. This has been one of the most respectful, in-depth debates I think we've had as a committee, and it's really compelling and amazing arguments on both sides. The one clarity that I pulled out of all of this is that there's not lack of support for the concept of bringing what is known as a gray area in the financial market to something of a little bit better understanding, nor is there a lack of desire to help those who truly need and desire to have assistance through medicinal purposes. But I do sense that this committee is not ready to take the leap to the next step, and I respect that. I know when we debated the previous amendment and the other bill, I think it was Mr. Culberson's bill, that was medicinal only, and I think we embraced that in a different fashion. So, Mr. Chairman, as I look at this, I think this committee has done remarkable here. I'd point out a couple things. If this were to be adopted, this would be a one-year solution, potentially, if it is enacted into law, and that could create some more disparity and uncertainty as we look ahead. But let it be known that this committee really cares about our constituents, and if we can provide assistance medicinally, I think I've heard that here. And Mr. Joyce, if this were not to prevail today, I hope you'll continue the effort and maybe in incremental steps. But we have recognized a tremendous clash, and that's the states versus the federal government. And they're out there on this, and we must come together and sort through this and work through this together. And but let me just thank each and every committee member who chose to voice your opinions. This has been a fantastic debate and discussion. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, I am basically, I think, at times a facilitator and mediator as chairman of this committee, but I have definite opinions about the legalization of marijuana. In New Jersey, we have medicinal marijuana. And we understand, as has been described, the plight of sometimes children and adults and the most excruciating pain that should have access, whether they're veterans or non-veterans. I think they basically should have access. But I visit about 90 schools a year, juniors and seniors in high school, some elementary schools. And the question is always, they say, what are we going to ask this dinosaur? Do you believe in the legalization of marijuana? And I said, I know in this room that you are often in middle school, 8th grade, and juniors and seniors in high school. You're adult enough, we hope, to make the right decisions. But what worries me, and I say to them quite blankly, I worry about the availability of your younger brothers and sisters. And I'm sympathetic to the plight of the banking industry and people who have large cash, sitting in some safe or under the counter. And I understand that this is the outgrowth of this legalization movement, and maybe I'm on the wrong side of history, but I feel extremely uncomfortable about moving ahead with this amendment. I think the tone of the discussion here, I feel that some of you share those same concerns, and I think it's about time we call for a vote. And I don't think there's any further. I get the last word. You have the last word. Minute to close, Mr. Joyce.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate the debate we had here. Certainly wish we could have a debate like this on the floor. The sad part about it is that sometimes we conflate the different issues. And if you would take the opportunity to see how these agencies and dispensaries are working, one has to show their license. They have to be over 21. It eliminates this black market trade. It keeps it from getting to kids, which is important for all law enforcement. I certainly spent 25 years making that happen. I know you have your ideas, but we got to talk about reality. Kids are going to find marijuana just like they find alcohol and other things. But the only way we can do is bring bring this money into the system so we know what we're dealing with and be able to talk apples to apples while we're doing this. And just so I may provide a little bit of insight here, the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell just this afternoon said marijuana uses is permitted in some states but not by federal law. Says the disparity puts federal regulators in a very difficult position, and the Fed would love to see this hazy issue clarified. The idea of putting this out today was to try to remove this cloud, was to try to bring the transparency that my friend Mr. Amity has talked about and try to put it out there in those states which this has been legislated or voted on by the will of the people. We represent the people. I may not be in favor of some things, but when the people want it, we should represent their interests. With that, I would ask each and every member here, I would urge them to support my amendment, and I surrender the balance of my time.
Okay, the question is on the Joyce amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, the opinion of the chair. I think the nays have it.